very pleased to welcome back David Martin, who spoke here, and perhaps some of you heard him about a year ago. And David gave a fascinating presentation which was on a topic that I knew absolutely nothing about, and I think that's probably true of most of the people in the room at the time. So last year he was talking about photographers, Japanese-American photographers working in the Seattle area. This time he's going to be talking about painters. But just to give a brief introduction to David, he's an American curator and writer who specialises in the art history of that region, Seattle and the Pacific Northwest. And he's associated with the Cascadia Art Museum in Edmonds, Washington. And he's produced a number of books, mostly about photographers, I think it's fair to say, working in that area. Of course, there were a lot of Japanese on the west coast of America, and equally obviously most of them ended up being incarcerated during the Second World War, so there were difficult times for some of them. Anyway, as I say, David has written a number of books about them. He's also got an honorary doctorate from Cornish College of the Arts, and in 2023, last year, he was the recipient of the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Pacific Northwest Historians Guild. So, over to you, David.
Oh. Do you all know where Seattle is?
Yes.
Listen, I don't. Maybe some people don't. My partner and I went to a Malaysian restaurant yesterday, just off of where we're staying in on St. Martin's Lane, and the proprietor, who had been born and raised in London, he was telling us which dish we should order because that's the one that tourists like the best. So I said, how do you know we're tourists? And he goes, oh, I don't know, you just look like a tourist. So he said, where are you from? And I said, Seattle. And he said, oh, Seattle, because everyone knows about Seattle as, you know, Microsoft and Google, everything. All the tech industries are in, Starbucks and everything. Amazon, thank you. And I said, have you been? And he said, no, that's around Chicago, isn't it? And I said, no, not even close. Well, can I drive there from Chicago? No, you can. So not everyone here it really knows where Seattle is. So we're in the upper northwest corner of the United States, just about into Canada. And as Jason mentioned, a lot of immigrants, Japanese immigrants, came to Seattle in the Northwest and really kind of set a foundation for arts in that region. But because of the incarceration during World War II, a lot of their works and a lot of their reputations were lost. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. And I'm just sharing stories with you. You can interrupt if you like. I'm not reading anything. And we'll go from there, okay? So the first wave of the Issei artists, that's what you're seeing on the left. So basically I wanted to show you that the earlier wave of the immigrants, some of the artists maintained through the different generations. And so this artist over here, Kenjiro Nomura, is also this man over here. So he maintained a reputation as sort of an impressionist and modernist, and then became an abstract artist later on in his career. And we'll talk about that a little bit. Okay, so the earliest in the Pacific Northwest, a lot of people, if you've ever heard of the artist Mark Tobey was a very famous American painter who was credited in the Northwest as being the first abstract artist, even though his abstractions didn't really start until the 1940s. And through my research, I actually found that there were other artists who were much more progressive during that time. And the earliest artist I can find was a man named Yasushi Tanaka. I should have apologized ahead of time for my pronunciation. So if I mispronounce the names, please forgive me. And I tried to use Google Translator so you can see their names in Japanese. Let's hope it's actually what it says. And so Mr. Tanaka was a Japanese-born artist and came to Seattle in 1907. Now, he was a very close friend of a man named Frederick Torrey, who was an art dealer from San Francisco. Now, Seattle at the time, at the turn of the century, in the early part of the 20th century, had a lot of money because of the gold rush and lumber industries, right? So they were trying to establish a culture there at the early part of the 20th century. And Mr. Tanaka was one of the people who helped to establish it. So he was friends with, are you familiar with Imogen Cunningham, the photographer? She's a very famous American photographer, also from Seattle originally. And she and Mr. Tanaka were very close friends. And they were friends also with Frederick Torrey, who purchased the Marcel Duchamp new Descending a Staircase, which made a sort of a commotion in the United States and New York at the Armory Show in 1913. But what a lot of people don't realize is that that painting was purchased by Mr. Torrey, and because of his friendship with Mr. Tanaka and with Imogen Cunningham, he brought the painting to Seattle in around 1915, I believe it was. And so consequently, Tanaka produced the first abstract art in the entire Northwest, especially in Washington State. And this is Cubist A from 1915, one of the few that have survived by him. It's in his home prefecture at Saitama, Japan. And you can see here's a self-portrait that he produced, and he was obsessed with the female form. And you can see on that image to your right, he was interested in color relationships and abstract figural compositions. And this is one of the works that he was known for. And at the time in Seattle, people were painting in more of a realistic style, so he really stood out among the other artists there. So this is very typical, this painting on your far right, of female figures along the Puget Sound. This dates from about 1915 or so. And Mr. Tanaka married a woman who was actually an arts writer named Louise Gebhardt Kahn. And they were married. If you look on the left, you'll see a self-portrait from 1913. That's when he met her. And I don't read Japanese, but a friend of mine who is told me basically the inscription, this self-portrait was made for the woman that was soon to be his wife. And it basically tells her how much she has brought him to life. Basically, he was a depressed person, and that meeting her has brought him to life. Now, she thought that he looked like Charlie Chaplin. That's what the little photo is. That's him dressed as Charlie Chaplin, and that was her nickname for him. It was CC instead of Yasushi, his actual name. I just located this photo of him from another family member. And as I was mentioning, he was, again, obsessed with the female figure and with different types of representations of women. You can see in this early article that was written, I think he actually wrote this, "Are all charming women cats?" We don't think so, but he apparently did. And this is one of his famous paintings called The Black Lily. And The Black Lily is a large painting, and the woman posing for as the figure was a woman named Mabel Lyle Ducasse, who was also an art student. Actually, she was one of his students, and she was a painter in the Seattle area. And this is a representation he made of her. Now, to us today, this doesn't look like anything extraordinary, right? It doesn't look like anything that would cause a furor, but it did. The local newspapers and the local people in Seattle thought it was horribly X-rated at the time because the woman was posing in a very wanton manner, and you can see her blouse is opened up. So this is 1919. So one of the things that I discovered that I thought was really funny is he was planning on moving to Paris, so he needed to make money to move to Paris the following year in 1920. So he displayed this painting in the Seattle Fine Arts Society, which was the predecessor to the Seattle Art Museum. And he displayed this painting and had throngs of people who waited in line to see this dirty picture of his. And he charged 10 cents per view. So this painting, unfortunately, isn't in Seattle, but I'm hoping to borrow it for an exhibition at some point. But he moves to Paris in 1920, and he comes across mostly artists and patrons who are looking for his nudes, his decorative female nudes. And he has quite a bit of success upon arriving here, or arriving in Paris, and produced some really beautiful decorative works, and really built up a market with GIs from the US and Europe, soldiers and military. Now, I recently found out that he did receive Tanaka did receive a little bit of not notoriety, but recognition early on right here in London. And that was because Mrs. Tanaka, who survived her husband, I believe he died in 1947, she continued to live in Paris. And she met two local art historians, Robert Short and Richard Morfett. I hope he was associated with the Tate Museum for quite a long time. And Robert Short is somebody I befriended by email, and he sent me all of these wonderful photographs. So here's both he and Mr. Morfett at the Tanaka residence in Paris in the 1950s. So he did receive a little bit of recognition here in London. The next artist I'm going to talk about is he is Issei as was Tanaka, and this is Kenjiro Nomura. And Kenjiro Nomura is probably the first artist I've studied in depth in Seattle, mostly because I met his son, and I'll give you an idea of that in a few minutes. So this is a self-portrait that we just recently located about 3 years ago, from a self-portrait from 1925. It belonged to his son. He had one son, and belonged to him and his wife. And both of them passed away right before I was producing an exhibition and co-wrote a book about him, unfortunately. But their daughter found this all rolled up, and it was nearly destroyed in a closet. It had been there for decades. And so we had it restored, and it's one of the few surviving self-portraits of a lot of these artists that I'm talking about. So these are works by Mr. Nomura, who came from Japan and then studied slightly in Japan, but he came over originally with his parents. And his parents decided to go back to Japan and left him in Seattle at the age of, I believe, 14 years old or 15. So he had to fend for himself and make a living besides taking art lessons. And here's some images of him. This is a very early photo. In the center there, Mr. Nomura is, you can see how young he is. This is he right there. And this is the class of a man named Foko Tadama, or Tadama. And before, when I was learning about all of these artists, they all studied with Mr. Tadama, who everyone thought was Japanese, but obviously he was not Japanese, he was Dutch. And he came to Seattle in 1913 to start one of the first art schools in Seattle. And this is a particularly rare photograph showing that a lot of his students became very well-known Japanese painters in the area, modernists. And when I was here last year, I spoke of Yasushi, what's his name? Soichi Tsunami, the great photographer. This is Tsunami taking a photograph of the group. He also was a painter and a sculptor, and he's photographing, and you can see he has his hand in his pocket triggering the bladder to trigger the photograph being taken. So this is a very rare image of the class sponsored by Mr. Tadama that I found about 10 years ago in Mr. Tsunami's papers. Now, one of the things, a lot of these artists really had no money. They were really scrambling just to survive. And so because Mr. Nomura was left basically on his own as a teenager, he decided to use his artistic skills in sign making and advertising. So he started the Noto Sign Company in Seattle's Chinatown area. And his first friend was also a close a student of Mr. Tadama. His name was Sho Toda, and that's them up in the upper left, and Noto is Nomura and Toda. And that's where the name came from. And the painting that you see of the clock there is the only painting I've ever been able to locate on Mr. Toda. He was a very successful painter in Seattle, but he returned to Japan around the early 1930s and took all of his work with him and just disappeared from the history books. So after Mr. Toda left the business, he had children to support and it wasn't making enough money. Mr. Nomura found another painter who was a friend, and his name was Kamikichi Tokita. And I don't know whether he did that because Mr. Tokita was talented or because he also had the T.O. in his last name and he didn't have to pay for changing his signage at all. So these are very typical of the types of works that Mr. Nomura, Kenjiro Nomura, was showing in Seattle and becoming very well known for. They're kind of a cross between American scene painting of the period, but they're a little bit more modern. They have influences of, I think, influences of German expressionism and other types of works that were being promoted at that time, especially in the Seattle area. In fact, you have a show of the Blue Rider group that starts today, I think, at the Tate, which I can't wait to see. That group was shown in Seattle, the Blue Rider group. Galka Shire, I believe her name was, the promoter. That was shown in 1928 in Seattle. It was a very early exhibition of the Blue Rider group, or the Blue Four at that time. And so a lot of these artists were very influenced by the Germans. And so in 1928, or 27 or 28, you can see this influence appearing in their modernist compositions. Do you know what the WPA was in the United States, the Work Progress Administration? That was set up by President Roosevelt, where artists, musicians, and even laborers would work under this Work Progress Administration. And because there was a very bad depression, economic depression at the time, they were paid wages. So that Mr. Nomura was part of that, of the WPA, as were other artists in the region and all over the United States, actually. Even people that became very famous in the US worked on the WPA initially. And so we see that, but then after the initial stage of it, which was the PWAP, Public Works of Art Project, only lasted 6 months, then they eliminated any Asian artists from the program. So here's Mr. Tokita's work. Mr. Tokita was his business partner with the sign company and also was interested in modernism. And this is a self-portrait of him from, let's see, around 1935. And he did a lot of these sort of, Mr. Nomura's work is very populated, they're very lively, and that you can see human activity, where Mr. Tokita's works are more isolated, that you rarely see people in his works. And he's really concentrating on forms, the regional forms of their where they lived. And most of these Issei artists and Japanese artists in Seattle really painted their own backyard. They did not go outside of their own Japantown or Chinatown. They sought information and sought subject matter in their own backyard, basically. Now, when I first saw this painting, this self-portrait by Mr. Tokita, I was because I started doing this so long ago, I became friends with a lot of the artists. And I saw this. Can you see this mark over here? So I asked his son, I said, well, you need to get the painting restored, get it cleaned and conserved, because, that might, eat away at the painting. It looks like a bad stain or something. And he said, oh, that's not a stain. He said, my father was a chain smoker, and all of his clothes had burn holes in them from cigarettes. So I'm glad nobody cleaned that off. And I'm happy to say that this painting has just, in the past year, entered the collection of the Smithsonian American Art Museum. I've been working very, very diligently to get a lot of these artists recognized throughout the United States by asking their families to donate. In this case, I did not ask the Tokita family to do this, but I have been encouraging other artists' families to donate so the work can get out and seen the rest of the country and the rest of the world. And again, this is more typical of Mr. Tokita's work. Again, you rarely see human figures in them. They're sort of isolated and, formal compositions, very modern. If you know the American artist Charles Birchfield, they're sort of in the vein of Charles Birchfield, and they're quite beautiful. And when I first located these paintings and these artists, a lot of these works were damaged and needed restoration. And so they have been slowly being restored over the years. Now, some of you probably know about, as great as our President Roosevelt was, he also did something signed into order, Executive Order 9066, resulting in the incarceration of Japanese Americans in 1942. And this is something that has been, people are trying to address it now. And a lot of the artists that I'm talking about, and some that you've seen already, were put into these camps against their will. There's a debate in the United States about calling these concentration camps because of the camps and the Holocaust, of course. But some people in the U.S. do call these concentration camps, and the families I knew so many of them where they actually lost everything. They were, including the artists, a lot of times if they had a sympathetic friend who was not Japanese, they would hide the works for them during that time. And so some of the artists produced works. They did it on their own, but they produced works. One of the most offensive ones, in my opinion, even though it's a nice piece of art, is Camp Harmony in Puyallup, Washington. This is Mr. Nomura's poster that he made. And what this was a holding center. So what happened was if you were Japanese American there in Seattle at the time, you would go to this holding center, basically a prison camp. And to call it Camp Harmony is just absolutely insane in my opinion, but he's showing different aspects of the camp there. And here's an actual photo of the families packing up their belongings and leaving first to Camp Harmony, which is about an hour outside of Seattle, and then on to Minidoka in Idaho, a barren sort of desert-like area. So here are some photos from Mr. Nomura's estate, and I did not know him, obviously, he was before my time, but here he is. This is he here, and here, and his wife, and his son, George. George was a friend of mine. What I found really shocking about this is where they were interned or incarcerated at Minidoka, but having no children, I had no idea that this is only less than 2 years time passed between these two photos. So you can see how George, the son, how fast he grew up in there. And he actually never held a lot of bitterness about being incarcerated during that time period, because he said he didn't have to go to school, he could play baseball all day, and he could meet girls easier. So it wasn't too bad for him, but I'm sure his parents were not very thrilled about this. And this is, I'll tell you very briefly, this is how I found out about this. If you look at the painting on your left, it's called Gymnasium. It's a painting of the Minidoka camp in Idaho. And when my partner Dominic and I moved to Seattle in 1986, I had apprenticed for almost 5 years with an art conservator, a paintings conservator. And when we arrived in Seattle, there were no conservators there. There was no one who knew how to restore paintings. And so I worked with several commercial galleries at the time, and one of them was in South Seattle. And what would happen is I would go to different galleries, they would take in artwork, and then I would restore it, and then they would take a percentage of what I charged. So this happened right after we moved to Seattle in the spring of 1986. And this man came in with a painting that was all rolled up. And he asked, to see the conservator. And so I took a look at it, and it had a lot of holes in it, and it had cat scratches in it. The cat had scratched at it and eaten through some of the painting. It was really a mess, but you could see basically what the painting looked like, and that was it. So I thought, I said to him, this is a beautiful painting, even the condition. I said, is this done by a famous artist? Because I thought the quality was so high. And he said, yes. He said, it's painted by my father, and it was painted when we were at camp. And he said, my father was well known, and then he became less famous after the war. And so I didn't know what he was talking about, because I grew up on the East Coast in Western New York, and I had never heard of these incarceration camps before. And so that was a painting that I restored for him. And then I restored others. And he had put all of these incarceration paintings that his father did, he hid them away because it meant it was really pretty horrible for his parents. He hid them away in their garage, and that's how they were all damaged. Mrs. Nomura, his mother, when they were released from Minidoka, committed suicide. And so it was him and his father to fend for themselves. So it was a very, very dark period for him and for them and a lot of family members. So that's how I met these Japanese families in 1986. And I called my parents after I met Mr. Nomura's son, and I asked them if they had ever heard of these camps, that American concentration camps. And my father said, of course. And I said, well, how come we never heard about this in school? I've never heard about it before. And he said, why do you think your last name is Martin? My family's Italian immigrants. And he said that during the war, his uncle was incarcerated as what they thought he was a spy, an Italian spy. And so everyone in the neighborhood that came from Italy dropped their name and anglicized it. So my name went from DiMartino to Martin. And so I learned something about my own history because of this painting. And then I went over to the Nomura's house, and I opened up a lot of packages with his son, and found these incredible watercolors. And even though they weren't stored properly, they were stored away from light. And so they really have not faded or anything. And they are a really incredible record of the incarceration during that time. I wanted to show you these because I don't know if anyone in Europe has seen this type of work before. It's something that really hasn't been shown that much in the United States. It's starting to, but it's really, really excellent artwork produced under duress by a lot of these artists. So these are all works by Mr. Nomura, and he produced hundreds of them. Now, as I mentioned, after the war, the Nomuras, like so many of the families, the Japanese families, they lost pretty much everything. They had homes, and if you're thinking in terms of if some of the artists were born in the 1880s or 1890s, they were already getting close to retirement age at the time. So all of their hard works and their homes and everything were lost, with not able to retrieve anything. So it was very, very difficult. And then Mr. Nomura had the added burden of having to raise his son and facing the fact that his wife had ended her own life. So he stopped painting. He was very, very discouraged, even though he had such a success in his early years. In fact, he was one of the first people from from the different groups in the United States to show at the Museum of Modern Art in the early 1930s in New York City. They had a show called Artists from 16 Cities or something like that. And he was selected. And so a lot of these earlier Japanese artists did exhibit during in major exhibitions during the 1930s and 40s at World's Fairs, things like that, but everything was lost after the incarceration. So Mr. Nomura went into a very bad depression after the war, and he quit painting. He didn't want to face it any longer. But he met some of the younger generation who really admired his work and looked up to him sort of as a mentor, someone that paved the way. So he starts meeting with these younger artists, and they formed together in Seattle. They formed this group. I can look on the screen here. They were called International Art Exhibitions. And when I first saw that, I thought, wow, they had international people from all over the world showing, in Seattle at the time. What it actually were non-Caucasian artists that were showing. And so they referred to it as an international exhibition. You can see some of the names: Chinese American, Japanese American. One of the artists was black. And so they had these exhibitions that were very, very successful. Now, they did exhibit with Caucasian artists as well, but they found camaraderie with each other and especially each other's lived experiences. So they were noticed by a very colorful figure from in Seattle at the time named Zoe Dusan. This is Zoe Dusan right here, and she's learning about Japanese ukiyo-e prints from some of the artists she represented in her group. Now she probably, because this is right after those exhibitions, those international exhibitions, Ms. Dusan came from New York to Seattle, and she was an art collector. She was very active in the Village in New York, and she was black. So she sort of was one of the few black cultural figures in Seattle at the time. And she saw, not only did she show works by well-known European artists like Arp and Picasso and Matisse, she decided to represent some of these Japanese artists. And so you see that they were gathered around some of the artists who were the mentors. This is John Matsudaira, Fei Chong, who was a Chinese-American artist in Seattle, and James Washington Jr., a black artist that had immigrated or migrated to the Northwest in the 1940s. Now, she's a very interesting figure. So she starts looking at this modernism produced by these Japanese artists in Seattle. And these are some of Mr. Nomura's. Now, remember I showed you his street scenes? They were sort of representational, more modernist type of street scenes. But after he goes through the incarceration and the loss of his wife, he meets these younger artists, and they start convincing him to work in a more abstract way. So he's relating sounds and feelings, atmospheric conditions to abstractions, where he's even making up brushwork. It doesn't really mean anything. It looks sort of like brushwork that you would see from Japan or China. It absolutely is not. It doesn't say anything. But these are works that he started producing. And the one on the left did not have a title, but his son told me he was very, very disturbed after Hiroshima. He lost a lot of family members in Hiroshima, and this was his response to the Hiroshima bomb after the war. So that's the painting on the left. And luckily, I was able to get a lot of this information while these people were around to give it to me, or we wouldn't know anything about the history of that painting or the motivation behind it. So Mr. Nomura starts once again to exhibit, and he gets selected for exhibitions throughout the United States. He's having a rebirth of his work due to his younger artist friends. And this painting called Harbor from 1953 was actually exhibited at the third biennial in Sao Paulo in 1955, right before he died. He died relatively young, but he did live to see that his painting was accepted into that. I'm going to go back to Zoe Dusan, the black woman that I mentioned that came from New York and settled in Seattle. And she was the real patron of a lot of these artists, as I mentioned. But she also gave, you know who Yayoi Kusama is. She had her first exhibition in the United States at the Zoe Dusan Gallery. So you have a black gallery owner showing Japanese artists. Several of them knew her from Japan. And you see some of the early photographs of her having her very first American debut at the Dusan Gallery. So here she is. And then these are three of her artists here: Paul Horiuchi, who I'll talk about in a second, George Tsudakawa, and John Matsudaira. So I knew all three of them very well, actually. And I was just thinking this morning when I was going over it, it's John, George, Paul, and Ringo's the only one that's not in the picture. So anyway, these are some very rare photos that a lot of people haven't seen. These I received from some of the families. Now I found this sort of repulsive review of Kusama's exhibition. This is probably the first review of her show in the United States from the. But look at what it says. They refer to her as a Japanese doll, and you couldn't get away with this today, right? And so here she is, and she had quite a lot of success. But her paintings, some of these Japanese artists who befriended her, collected some of her work. And so if you see the work post her first show, there's definitely a connection because these artists were older than she was, and you can see an influence. And that's never been really talked about in her oeuvre because most people don't know of these other artists. So I'm trying to change that anyway, and see how that is how that influenced her work. This coming to Seattle and working with these artists, and you know, reputation has really, really interested me almost as much as the art itself. Like, why do you all know who she is, right? Why do we know who she is, but we don't know who the other artist is? You know, that's something that really intrigues me. And I mean, we went to the Tate Modern yesterday, and they still have her Infinity room on display. It's been, I don't know how many years it's been there, and there's a long queue to get in, and you have to wait 2 years or something to get in to see it. Why? I mean, I think she's great and everything, and but it just really shows how a lack of scholarship on the part of other museums causes this type of loss of reputation. And she's in her 90s now, I believe. And I always thought, well, I brought up the Beatles before. I kind of think of her as the Keith Richards of of the art world without the drugs. So she's really thriving today, luckily. And but she did get her start with these artists in Seattle. So I mentioned George Tsudakawa, born in 1910. Now, some of the artists who were not born in Japan but were of Japanese origin actually went back to Japan to study. It was very common at the time in Seattle and maybe in other parts of the country. So this is a self-portrait from 1947. And George Tsudakawa was a very sort of an amazing artist who mastered several different mediums, from painting to printmaking. And we have a whole series of his Christmas cards that document him and his wife, and then as he added children to the family, they keep showing up in Christmas cards over the years. So his mother died young, and his father sent him to live with his mother in Japan in the 1920s, and that's where he was educated and received his first schooling in art. But he was never interested that much in Japanese art in Japan. He actually was at the time of the Impressionists, and the European Modernists were really what was popular in Japan when he was there. And so that's what he was looking at, modernism. And you can see this progression of, here's a portrait of a friend of his that he made at the University of Washington when he was a student. And you can see he does a sort of representational painting of his friend studying or writing a letter, and then he gradually abstracts the figure, and you can see it moving into a more and more abstract type of representation. Here are some other works, early works by him when he was at the university. The people that were his instructors at the University of Washington were primarily schooled in Paris and schooled in Europe, and they promoted the School of Paris and different types of modernism. I did a book on George Tsutakawa's early works on paper. I think it was 2 years ago, somewhere around there. But Tsutakawa was known really as a sculptor and as a three-dimensional artist, fountains especially. And one time I was at his son's house. It's the actual house that George lived in. And I was looking for a watercolor, and he said, well, I don't know where they are, go look. Well, I went in his basement, in his attic, and I found hundreds of them that have never been seen by the public. So I did an entire book on these. And my favorite thing that happened was one of the paintings, I'll show it to you, that I used on the cover of the book. Well, I'll wait till I show you, till we get to that. But anyway, so George goes from painting to sculpture, and if you know Alexander Archipenko, the great Ukrainian-American sort of cubist sculptor, he would come in the mid-1930s to the University of Washington and teach classes there, and George studied with him and became his prize student. And we've located, a couple of years ago, we located all of the drawings from the Archipenko class that he took in the mid-1930s. And that is Archipenko a little bit later at the University of Washington. He's the guy with the mustache, and the older man is was head of the art department named Walter Isaacs, who had been Paris trained. So George, unlike a lot of these artists, was drafted into the army. Or no, he was not drafted. He joined the army, and here he is in 1942, and his work goes from this sort of abstractions based on Parisian, mostly School of Paris, and he starts working with surrealism. So here's a work that he did depicting Camp Fannin in Texas, and this sort of surrealist work from 1944, a sketch that he had produced while he was in the military. So when he was in the military, he was his family was all incarcerated, as I mentioned, at Minidoka, but he wasn't, because he was in the military. And he went to go visit his mentors there. So he went to see Mr. Nomura in 1943. That's one of the camps at Minidoka. And Mr. Fuji, that's an interior drawing of his the little tiny shacks that they were set in, to live in during that time period. So luckily this little sketchbook survived, and it shows him going through, traveling while he was in the military and going to Minidoka to visit his family, friends, and he meets the woman he would fall in love with, who became his wife. He was in Arkansas. He was a great jazz fan. And these are some works of some of the black jazz musicians that were made in the 1940s while he was in the military. He once told me that even though he was Japanese, they did not, the Army didn't allow the Caucasian servicemen to go to the black part of town. But George didn't really care, and I thought it was kind of odd that he was considered Caucasian, but he would sneak, these are not very big, so he would sneak his sketchbook into these clubs and do these remarkable sketches of some of the big band musicians and dancers in Arkansas, in the black clubs of Arkansas. So when he was visiting one of his friends at the, it was Mr. Fuji, yes, no, Tokita, Mr. Tokita. Now, George, a lot of this, there wasn't this type of artwork being shown in Seattle. The Seattle Art Museum had just formed in 1933, so it did not have a big collection. And once in a while, you would get traveling exhibitions. So George would take the train to Chicago or New York City and see what the latest things that were being shown in there. And he really identified with Kandinsky. And so here's a work, and I think what this is, I'm just guessing this, but what I think is that because this was made in the Minidoka prison or the camp, I think he was trying to show his mentors, these older artist friends, what Kandinsky was like. Because you see, there's a little bit of a similarity in that composition that he probably noticed. And then he's giving an idea to his mentors, to the older, to show what was kind of modern and new in the United States. And here we have a work that was inspired, obviously, by Stuart Davis's Egg Beater #1 from 1927, and then George's depiction of Fort Snelling in 1946. And again, these were all part of a book that I did on him, and dug all of these out of the basement and the attic. And when we designed, I didn't do it, but when the book designer did the cover, he used this, a detail from him. And his son called me up and he said, "Oh, David, I love the cover design for the book. Where did you find that painting?" I said, "In your basement." He said, "I own that painting." And I said, "Yes, you do. But if you don't want it, I'll happily take it from you." Here's some more of his School of Paris inspired beautiful works that have been hidden away for decades. But these are what he was known for primarily, the Obos sculpture that he was, after studying with Archipenko, he goes between painting and sculpture, and that's what he becomes most noted for, these beautiful sculptures. But I like his paintings quite a bit. This one really is a favorite of mine. It's called Ikada #4 from 1950. And he explained to me that, I guess Ikada, I'm probably mispronouncing it, it's the word for raft in Japanese. And he created a series of paintings based on his observation of timber. This is the timber rafts that were floating down the lake that he would see on his way to work. He became a professor at the University of Washington. And this one in particular depicts an early morning view of the rafts with the logs covered in frost and snow glistening in the sunlight. So it's a beautiful abstraction, and again, a lot of people don't know this work because there's been so much concentration on his sculpture and then particularly on his fountains, his sculptural fountains. And that's what he's most known for today. But I'm trying to change that because I think he was a top-rate painter as well. So another mysterious figure who was a very close friend of George Tsudekawa was Shiro Miyazaki. And they went to high school together, and they both won national awards for their block printing, linoleum block prints. And between he and Mr. Miyazaki and George Tsudekawa, they would win awards and enter all types of national competitions at a very young age. And they were very successful. That's a monoprint that Mr. Miyazaki made of George later in his life. But take a look at his lifespan. He only lived to be 29 years old. What happened was Miyazaki was sort of a modernist as well, and he was very much involved in the labor movement and farmers' rights, and actually worked in labor-related jobs. And his father, who was an old-fashioned man, did not like this, and he disowned him. And so he was basically on his own, working with George, and he ends up producing some really interesting works. I find them very interesting. These are self-portraits, and as you know, in the Northwest, We have a lot of Native American people there. And here he is picturing himself in between totem poles. And so you have this wonderful blend that you find in art of the Northwest of indigenous art and then artists from different backgrounds like Japanese with Mr. Miyazaki's work. Here's some more of his works that won awards. And again, we have the totem pole with him depicting himself as this sort of shadowy figure being rejected by his family. Most of these have never been seen before, by the way. His nephew sent me these so I could share them with you. Here's some of his paintings that he ended up moving to Los Angeles to basically get away from his family, and was working as a farm worker and with political labor movement there. And so he continued to paint, but then started getting ill, unfortunately. And he was diagnosed with asthma and lung-related problems. And he kept working. He had a very strong correspondence with George. Never left, making block prints. And here we found an Edward Weston portrait that he converted. It's of the artist Orozco, the Mexican artist, and he converted it into a black and white linoleum cut. And unfortunately, as I said, he was thought to have had asthma and some type of lung ailment. It turned out that he had lung cancer and died a very horrible, painful death at the age of 29. This is his funeral, and that's George in the red circle there with his casket. And George, luckily, the father didn't want anything to do with this, so George took all of the work back from California and kept it and stored it. So if it weren't for George's actions on behalf of his friends, we would have zero. We would have pretty much nothing to remember him. Paul Horiuchi, another artist of this generation. Remember I told you that Mr. Nomura had befriended some of the younger artists and they were teaching him to become more involved in abstraction. Paul Horiuchi was one of them. He starts out as a painter in the manner of his mentors, doing this sort of realism, but stylized realism. That's a portrait, a self-portrait from 1932 on the left, and a portrait of his wife, Bernadette, painted about 10 years later. He was also a musician, and he made a living as an antiques dealer. He also was not incarcerated because he moved further east into Wyoming, I believe it was, and worked for the railroad. So he was not incarcerated during World War II. So he was spared that. And his son became a good friend of ours, so he donated, before his death, he donated the self-portrait and the portrait of his mother to our museum. These are typical of the types of paintings that Paul made. There's also kind of on the gloomy side, but interested in atmospheric conditions and the demolition of buildings, and just very few figures in his work, with the exception of this here. It depicts a fisherman. And then he, in the Chinatown, or Nihonmachi, as it was called, Japantown in Seattle, there were people who read the newspapers. If you look at George Uchida's photograph on the left, that's how people would get their news in Seattle at the time, or the Japanese people or Asian people, Chinese as well. And so they would go and look at these billboards of newspapers being posted publicly so people could find out news about locally and international news. And Paul turns away from painting, and he sees this interesting type of layer upon layer upon layer of these posted newsprints posted in the Japantown, and he starts making collage. This is from 1956, and he completely changes. He pretty much stops painting. He does a little bit once in a while, but he concentrates on the collage medium. We're going to step back a little bit and see the other part of the earlier artist named Takuichi Fuji. He was also part of that early group that studied in the 1920s and 30s. And he was, again, another modernist, active with the Seattle Art Society back then. And these are some works. Now, during this period of internment or incarceration, there was actually it looked like a school yearbook called the Minidoka Interlude. So all of the people that were incarcerated there at the time, they made like a yearbook, and all of the people are pictured in there, all of their families and everything. And so Mr. Fuji did a lot of the illustrations. That's an illustration from this book, and these recently have surfaced in the past 7 or 8 years through the family. And then this still life of that from his little cabin that he lived in at Minidoka, showing the sunflowers still life, and then with the cabins that they were being held prisoner there. And I wanted to show you these. These are things that have not been seen very much by the public. These are also Minidoka scenes. These are very, very small because of they were done on small sketchbooks, so they're only about this big, most of them. And I'll be working on a book of these shortly. And you can see they're very interesting observations here, a view of a sort of rundown part of town. But I like this one because he's actually drawing in the dark, so he has this light that he's shining up so he can do a drawing of the interior of where he was being held. On the way to the camps in the bus, and then the sort of bleak landscape looking out covered with snow, the Idaho landscape. But he's still looking at modernism, so here he does a modernist view of the incarceration camp here. And again, one of the things that I've been trying to do is to not try to focus solely on these incarceration camp paintings, because they were victimized, and I don't want to re-victimize these people, because they were painters in their own right before they were incarcerated. So I'm trying to promote their work as artists because they were very successful, but at the same time we can't forget what happened to them, especially in the United States with our current climate. It's pretty awful. And I don't want to forget it, but I want to promote them as fine artists as well. And you can see he was also influenced by Kandinsky and that group of artists. And I mentioned Mark Tobey before, who became internationally known. Some people, including myself, believe that his abstractions came from his knowledge of Japanese and Chinese calligraphy. And so this is a photo that I found a few years ago from one of the artist's families. Here's Mark Tobey up in the upper right. He was if you don't know who he was, extremely successful internationally. And then there's George Tsudikawa and Paul Horiuchi. And they would meet at George's house once every couple of weeks and do sumi painting. And these artists would teach Mark Tobey how to do sumi painting in the home. And what George's son told me, that he didn't think it was that artistically motivated, but it was a good way for them to get loaded on sake. So it was more of a social thing that as well as an artistic endeavor. And then the last artist I'm going to mention is my good friend John Matsudaira. Here he is. He was a little bit of a prankster. Here's a portrait of John that was painted by Mark Tobey, I think in 1959, when they were all painting together and using this type of Japanese sumi technique, Japanese brushwork. That's a photo I took of John back in 1999 with an unfinished portrait of him by his friend Milt Simons, who was really the only black artist active in Seattle at the time. So John's story is that he was actually born in Seattle. I think I put his real name. I should have mentioned it before. This John was not his real name. It was Takahisa Matsudaira. And I should have told you Paul Horiyuchi, who did the collage, his name wasn't Paul either. It was Chikamasa. And he told me he took the name Paul, as a lot of immigrants did. They wanted to Americanize their name, but he took it after Paul Cézanne because he was such a very big fan of Paul Cézanne's work. So here's John Matsudaira, and he was very, very shy. He wouldn't let me do anything. I couldn't do even a show for him until after he passed away, unfortunately. He was just very, very shy, but there was a reason for it. He was came from a very, very large family in Seattle, also went back to Japan to be educated. And when he was in Minidoka with his family, he was the oldest of children. I forget how many there were. I think there were 12 kids in the family. This is a little watercolor sketch that he did. And then during the time he was actually incarcerated in the camp, he joined the U.S. Army. So there's a photograph of him as a soldier, as an American soldier, and he joined the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which was, I don't know if it still is, but it was the most highly decorated troop in the United States military history. It might have changed by now, but it was up until about 10 years ago. And so there he is, but unfortunately, when he was sent, this was World War II, he was sent to Italy for combat, and he was in foxhole under a very strong fire. And this is a self-portrait that he did when he came out of the hospital. He told me that he was actually freezing cold. It was in December or so, or January, or whatever it was. And he said he was really, really cold, and there was an explosion, and then he suddenly felt warm and felt water, or felt like moisture around him, and then he realized he had been hit in the gut by shrapnel. And so he did live, obviously, but here are some sketches that he made during his recuperation. He was in the hospital. He had 24 surgeries and was in hospital for 3 years, recuperating. This painting is a depiction of himself afterwards, of himself being injured in the foxhole, and you can see the blood flowing out there, and he's kind of half dead in the picture. And this, I'm happy to say, was just recently acquired last year by the Smithsonian American Art Museum. I love this. This is a portrait of him, a watercolor self-portrait of him recuperating in hospital. And there's an actual photo of him, and there he is, not giving up on his art there while he's recuperating. So again, like some of the other artists, he went between sort of representational work and abstraction. And these are some works that he started exhibiting in Seattle in the 1940s. He was went to art school from the GI Bill after the war, and he started being accepted into local regional exhibitions. And here he is with again, contemporaneously, he was doing sort of realism. This is a group of mountain ranges next to our Mount Rainier. And then he starts doing these beautiful lyrical abstractions at the same time, and that's what he became known for. He was, I mentioned, a friend of Yayoi Kusama. They were good friends. And so this is a work that he did during that time. This is in his daughter's collection. And this is a painting that was done in 1961, a very large abstraction that his family donated to our museum. It was in the Century 21 World's Fair in Seattle in 1962. And some of his work was just acquired not only by the Smithsonian, but also by the Huntington Museum in Southern California. Very, very beautiful work by him. When I went through this work after John died, went over the work with his wife and daughter, who were friends of mine, I found this painting that I really enjoyed, and it's called, sorry for my mispronunciation, Tombo Suri from 1953, and he based it on a poem that was by this poet, and the poet had lost her child very young, and it means the dragonfly, and this is her poem, My Little Boy Catching Dragonflies, Where Has He Run Away? So that was John's interpretation of this Japanese poem from the 1700s. And I'm going to finish my talk by telling you and just sharing 2 more slides about the great delight this is for me to be able to talk about these artists. And because I have a museum that's outside of Seattle that was pretty much built and created so I could do this type of work, luckily, I wanted to show you some of the happy family members. So this is Mr. Tokita's family on the left with his 2 sons and his daughter on the left. And how would you like to look like that at 89 years of age? That's Mr. Tokita right there in the center. And then this is John Matsudaira's wife and his 4 children. And so I'm very proud of this because John never wanted any type of notoriety, even though he was so good. But he was just content to live in his own little world. And Mrs. Matsudaira died within a year of our exhibition. And I'll close it on this. This is Mr. Nomura's family, and that's his granddaughter who never met him and her family. And we did a big exhibition and book on his work, the first published, and I brought a copy of our book to his grave. So hopefully he's looking down on us and seeing it. So thank you all for letting me share this information with you.